It's been 3 years, but I can still feel his breath on my neck at night. I thought I'd imagined it, that the heat was playing tricks on me. But now, I'm not so sure. Because when I looked into the old man's eyes, I saw something that shouldn't exist. It all started when I was in Ghana, visiting my uncle's village. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a week of quiet, far from the city. My uncle, Kwame, lived in a small village that clung to the edge of a dense forest. People there lived simple lives, relying on the land and the little they could trade. But there was something about the village, something I couldn't put my finger on. The air felt heavier, like it was full of secrets, and the villagers seemed uneasy. At first, I thought it was just because I was an outsider. But it wasn't that. They were scared, and I was about to find out why. The first night was when I heard the whispering. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it, soft, almost like the wind, but there was no wind. The words were in Twi, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I figured it was someone outside, so I tried to ignore it. But the whispering kept getting louder, closer. The next morning, I asked my uncle about it. He just gave me a strange look and told me not to worry. But the look in his eyes, it was like he wanted to say something but couldn't. That day, I wandered around the village, trying to get a feel for the place. I noticed there was a part of the village that everyone avoided, a cluster of old, crumbling huts near the forest edge. When I asked about it, the villagers just shook their heads and told me to stay away. One old woman finally spoke up and said something about the man with no shadow. But before I could ask more, she hurried off, leaving me with more questions. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispering started again, only this time, it was right outside my window. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard a soft knock on the door. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour? Slowly, I got up and opened the door, expecting to see one of the villagers. But there was no one there. Just darkness and the thick, humid air. I closed the door, my heart racing, and turned to go back to bed. But then I saw it, at the far end of the room, near the corner, a shadow that didn't belong. It was darker than the rest of the room, and it moved, sliding across the floor like it was alive. I stood there, frozen, as the shadow grew taller, taking shape. And then, out of the darkness, a man appeared. He was old, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. But what terrified me the most was that he had no shadow of his own. I looked down, and there was nothing, just the cold, hard floor. The man stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He opened his mouth, and I heard the same whispering that had haunted me the night before. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't move. The man reached out a hand, and as he did, the whispering grew louder, more frantic. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, the man was gone. The room was empty, and I was left standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I told my uncle what had happened. He looked at me with a mix of fear and sadness and finally told me the story. The man with no shadow had been a powerful figure in the village long ago, a shaman who dealt with dark magic. But he'd crossed the line, made a pact with something evil, and the village had turned against him. They drove him out, but not before he cursed the land, vowing to return and claim what was his. No one had seen him in years, but the villagers believed he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come back. I left the village the next day, but the experience stayed with me. I can still hear the whispering sometimes when the night is quiet, and I always look over my shoulder, expecting to see that shadow creeping closer. If you ever find yourself in a remote village, far from the safety of the city, listen carefully. Pay attention to the whispers in the night, and whatever you do, never open the door. Because some things are better left forgotten. And if you ever meet a man with no shadow, run.